Hello once again, everyone, and welcome to our combined Sunday school classes, the Agape class and the Young Men's Bible class from First Presbyterian Church in Greensboro. I'm Lane Ridenhour, and I thank you for joining us once again as we gather for worship and study on this Sunday, March 7th. This is the third Sunday of Lent. Our Sunday school teacher, Sandie Gravett, will be joining us shortly as she continues her new series, Dreaming Big, Constructing Hope, a study of the text in Isaiah chapters 40 through 55. But first, let's sing a hymn together. As is our custom, we sing a hymn at the beginning of Sunday school, and during the Lenten season, we're using hymns that were written in and about the subject of the cross and our relationship with the cross. Beneath the Cross of Jesus is a fairly well-known hymn and was written in 1868 by Elizabeth Clephane. She was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, and she was the daughter of the Sheriff of Fife. Fife was a county region near Edinburgh. She wrote only a handful of hymns during her lifetime, but of the 12 or so that she wrote, only 2 are still heard today. This one, Beneath the Cross of Jesus, and another called The 90 and the 9, which may not be so familiar to us right now, but 50 years ago it was still in the Presbyterian hymn book, and I understand it was a favorite hymn of Dr. Charles F. Myers, who was the senior minister here from 1907 until 1944. In the hymn Beneath the Cross of Jesus, Miss Clephane writes about taking her own stand at the cross. Now, the poetry of this time period might not be so familiar, the language being used might not be so familiar to younger Christians today, but the concept of taking a stand meant to have convictions or to take a firm position on something. In her case, it was an expression of her faith. In the first verse, she writes, I fain would take my stand. Fain is also a word that might not be familiar to younger Christians. It is the willingness or gladness to do. She fain would take her stand. She would gladly or willingly profess her faith. The poetry in the various verses is rich with quotes from Bible texts, but what really makes this hymn so beautiful to me is the harmonies used in the accompaniment. The melody was written by Ira Sankey, who was a gospel singer with the Dwight Moody Evangelical Campaign, but the harmonies were written by an obscure musician none of us have ever heard of. His name was H. Elliott Button, and he was an English musician and quite the amateur by his own profession. But he would take melodies and write these very emotional accompaniments, harmonizations of the melodies, to make them so singable and so tightly held to the people who sang them. As usual, I'll put the words up on the screen for you, and I'll invite you to sing along with me. Beneath the Cross of Jesus, I fain would take my stand. Beneath the cross of Jesus, I fain would take my stand. The shadow of a mighty rock within a weary land, a home within the wilderness, a rest upon the way from the burning of the noontide heat and the burden of the day. Upon that cross of Jesus, mine eye at times can see the very dying form of one who suffered there for me. And from my smitten heart with tears to wonders I confess, the wonders of his glorious love and my unworthiness. I take across thy shadow for my abiding place, I ask no other sunshine than the sunshine of his face, content to let the world go by, to know no gain or loss. My sinful self, my only shame, my glory, all the cross.
In our study of Isaiah 40 to 55 thus far, we've been talking about the prophet making a major theological shift to help the people reorient to new circumstances. It's my contention that when the theological ground underneath our feet quakes, we don't do a 180 in an instant. That is, we don't go automatically from pointing north to pointing south. More commonly, we inch along a little bit at a time, and then one day we come to recognize that some significant movement has taken place. I emphasize the incremental nature of the change because it is often hard to recognize that we've moved at all. Think of it like looking in the mirror and not seeing that you've put on a few pounds, or how you still see yourself as young and can miss those wrinkles and gray hairs sneaking into the picture. Even when something dramatic happens in our lives to launch us from one place to another, we can nonetheless find ourselves clinging to the familiar out of habit as much as anything else. We either feel at ease with our accustomed go-tos, or they are in some other way hard to let go. Theologically, we have been trained into certain ways of thinking and speaking, and we find any departure often one step forward, two steps back. John Maynard Keynes, the great economist, gives us a quote that sums it up. The difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones. A simple example can illustrate the point. Take the Apostle Paul. We are accustomed to talking about Paul as making, after a dramatic encounter with the risen Christ, a strong swing from persecutor of Christians to the leading voice for that same community. While it is great storytelling, it sells short how much of a Pharisee remained in Paul. It is likely more accurate to say that Paul came to see what God was doing in Christ as part of the ongoing work God had already been about with the Jews, with a focus specifically designed to be more open and accessible to non-Jewish communities. And most scholars believe that Paul continued to live as a Jew, keeping the law and understanding God's work in Christ through the prism of his Jewish background. Today, we're going to look at Isaiah chapter 47, and I want you to keep those thoughts in mind because they can help us with the interpretive issues that bubble up in this chapter. Let me start out by saying Isaiah 47 is an unusual choice to highlight when you have all the grand poetry of Isaiah 40 to 55. I'm not the only one who thinks so. If you follow the lectionary, Isaiah 47, or at least sections of it, will appear in the daily lectionary readings. Some of it, in fact, showed up in January 2021. But it's not a passage you're ever going to hear on a Sunday or during a festival season. Why not? Well, as a matter of fact, it is a passage that celebrates the downfall of one's enemies, and it does so in some incredibly brutal language if you understand how to read it. Let's take a look. Come down and sit in the dust, virgin daughter Babylon. Sit on the ground without a throne, daughter Chaldea. For you shall no more be called tender and delicate. Take the millstones and grind meal. Remove your veil. Strip off your robe, uncover your legs, pass through the rivers. Your nakedness shall be uncovered, and your shame shall be seen. I will take vengeance, and I will spare no one. There are a number of oracles similar to this one in the prophetic corpus, and lots of different nations get spoken about in texts like this one. We also know that we run across similar language in a variety of other biblical passages, most notably in the Psalms. When we try to make sense of this particular one, we remember that the Babylonians had destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, and that many of the people of Israel were exiled, lots of them in the city of Babylon itself. We are also aware that the Persians had overtaken the Babylonians and had captured their capital city of Babylon in a time proximate to the words of this prophet. And we know that this shift in geopolitical power touched off changes that the writer of Isaiah 40 to 55 is celebrating, is lauding. Why then do we have this text on the punishment of Babylon? Well, we could take a scholarly approach, and we could talk about how scholars argue about whether this text is talking specifically about the Persian defeat of the city, because we know historically that the Persian overtaking of the city was not as bloody as one might imagine such a power shift to be. But that's not really where you want to go with a Sunday school lesson. Rather, I want to get into a few theological ideas that should make us as readers more than a little bit uneasy with where this writer goes, particularly when we think about how this prophet is seeking to shift the people of Israel's perception of themselves and their relationship to God, and to redefine what God is asking them to do and how. When I talk about uneasy, you might say, how uneasy should I get? Well, I would say Psalm 137 verses 8 to 9 level of uneasy. When you get this happiness about the destruction of Babylon, this joy about them getting paid back for what they've done, and you even have that very famous inclusion about joy over their babies being dashed against rocks. That's how uneasy I want you to be. That's how much I want you to squirm. Why? Why do I want to make you uncomfortable today? First off, as this passage would show, I want us to recognize that not everything in the biblical text is something we want to embrace uncritically. The writers and thinkers who contribute to the biblical corpus certainly left us with some of the most beautiful and powerful words we would ever want in our tradition. They gave us a legacy that has fed generations of believers across all kinds of places and throughout time. But the social and cultural circumstances of any of these writers are distinct from what we know, and their world accepts and values things that is not always consonant with what we understand to be appropriate. More importantly, when we squirm, we think. When we wrestle with our uneasiness, we grow. Some of the lessons with these texts will revolve around difficulties in reorienting our theological thinking, but others will teach us something about our very human responses to things that hurt us and challenge us to think about how to respond differently. Ready to go? The oracle that begins the way that I've shown you follows a pattern in the prophetic corpus of addressing cities or nations as women. There's a reason that the prophets choose to do so. The biblical material was written mostly by elite men and addresses an audience composed largely of the same. As a result, when they're striving to describe humiliation, they need to do it in a way that men in the role as a head of household would understand. Let me draw it out for you. If a senior man was unable to protect and defend the women under his control, he fails in one of his primary duties. If men in charge of a country see it fall to another nation, they have failed in their responsibility as leaders. These metaphors of women, in short, communicate clearly to the intended audience about the level of their failure. However, these texts communicate not only because of the role of women vis-a-vis men in a household, but they also conjure up and lay out what happens to women in situations of war. And here we see the impact of community violence on the body of a woman. This virgin daughter is not simply forced to go from a life of comfort to one where she must work as a manual laborer. She is also sexually assaulted. Verse 3 uses language that is a euphemism in the Hebrew for rape. While it may have taken until the 21st century for rape to be categorized as a war crime, it has long been the practice of invading armies to brutalize women, whether they do it as the spoils of war, as part of taking women into positions of servitude or slavery, or whether they are extending dominance in a place by taking the women of the conquered as wives. But the full range of pain for women is not done with those first verses. If we go down to verses 8 to 9, we are no longer speaking of a virgin daughter, but we're talking instead of a married woman who is also a mother. And in this case, we hear about how this woman will lose her spouse, and she will also suffer the deaths of her children. We don't know how those losses come. Maybe they were killed in the battles themselves. Perhaps they could not survive the deprivations of war, which often included sieges of cities that could lead to outcomes like starvation. Or maybe they were felled by the diseases that often accompanied invading armies. If all of this use of women in order to describe the outcome of war and battles is not disturbing enough for you, there are some other important things to notice as well. First, the tone of this prophet goes beyond censure or even condemnation. Let me give you 3 examples. Now therefore hear this, you lover of pleasures. You felt secure in your wickedness. You said, nobody sees me. But evil shall come upon you, which you cannot charm away. This is the voice of God, and it is gloating or even mocking. In fact, scholars label the passage itself a taunt song. When I want to explain taunting to you, I actually thought that an Oregon high school sports official had the right idea. He wrote, "The rules define taunting as any attempt to embarrass, ridicule, or demean. And if the point of a passage like Isaiah 47 is, as stated, to demonstrate the superiority of Israel's God, then perhaps this taunting is something that we need to think about. It seems beneath God in some ways." If we go back to the high school sports rules, that same official wrote, "Taunting and baiting an opponent is contrary to the basic concept of fair play and honorable competition. Taunting an opponent is exactly opposite the type of conduct and behavior which participation is intended to teach." But you're saying, this is not sports. It's a battlefield. Lives have been lost. Stakes are high. Who could fault someone for a little bit of a celebration when one's enemy is annihilated? Well, let me illustrate the same point about the danger of taunting with a wartime example. I recently finished reading a book about the Yalta Conference between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin in February 1945. This was as the war in Europe was ending, and these three came into it realizing that one of the biggest mistakes at the end of World War I was the Treaty of Versailles. The Germans felt it was a dictated peace, that it ground them unnecessarily into the dust, and it precipitated conditions that led to the rise of the Nazi Party and ultimately the breakout of World War II. They wanted to avoid a similar toll this time around. And while we can argue about their successes or their failures in doing that, one thing is for sure. It's all too easy to forget whether you're negotiating your nation's interest in a treaty ending a war, or if you are reading a passage like this one. We are not simply talking about nations and national interests. We're talking mostly about people and the suffering of ordinary folks in the event of war is extraordinary. And here, we are also dealing with another factor that needs to be kept in mind. The people of Israel had been defeated. They had been removed from the city of Jerusalem. Their temple had been destroyed, and many of them had come to Babylon to live. They had made their homes there for at least a generation at the point when this prophet is speaking. Was this latest upheaval something that they wanted to embrace? Was it good news for them? We know that this particular prophet is on the side of Cyrus the Great, and he wants the people to engage with Cyrus and to accept the offer to rebuild the temple, to see that as worth the effort. Thus, to succeed, the prophet is also having to do some fancy theological footwork. It was common to assume that when one was defeated militarily, one's gods suffered defeat as well. They had been proven ineffective, and we see some of that language here in this passage. Verses 12 and 13 of chapter 47 discuss the utter lack of utility among the astrologers and others who worked on behalf of the Babylonians. This thinking also points us back to chapter 46, where the gods of the Babylonians, referenced here as Bel and Nebo, are imagined as removed and going into an exile of their own. And that fact is for the author, because these gods are only shiny metal objects, not at all like the reality of Israel's God. But this prophet is also having to talk about why the people of Israel should see these gods as defeated and not see their military loss, their destruction of their capital, their loss of their temple in the same way. The prophet thus, in both chapters 46 and 47, makes the assertion that Israel's God, among all the gods in the world, is alone capable. Listen to me, house of Jacob, remnant of the house of Israel, who have been born by me from your birth, carried from the womb, even to your old age. I am God. Even when you turn gray, I will carry you. I have made, and I will bear. I will carry, and I will save. Moreover, the backbone for that assertion is that while Israel was defeated, Israel's God was not. In Isaiah 47, the prophet says God was using Babylon to punish the people of Israel. I was angry. I profaned my heritage. I gave them into your hand. You, Babylon, showed them no mercy. On the aged, you made your yoke exceedingly heavy. Now, we talked last week about how this was not a new idea. Jeremiah, for instance, had been pushing it for years. While it sidestepped some of the thornier questions about covenantal promises of a land and support for the Davidic kingship, it was also brokering some new theological ground. And we've already talked a little bit about what that newness looks like. This prophet is positing Israel as a suffering servant. And that suffering is part and parcel of how the covenant relationship with God is going to bring Israel into a position where they can be a light to all the nations, drawing other people to them and working on behalf of God in that effort. Even with all that talk, however, about how Israel is changing and morphing on this international stage, we are seeing here a couple of steps forward and a couple of steps backward, or at least some sideways steps and some shuffling along them. We should not be surprised. Here's what I'm seeing. The writer is certainly pushing new ideas, but at the same time turning back and leaning in to tropes that are antithetical to that new thinking. He's trying to say to us that we can hold side by side the idea of a suffering servant being a light to all of the nations with a triumphal, vengeful God dancing around on the heads of one's enemies. In this paradigm, there is still a desire for vindication or vengeance, and that vengeance is for that servant. Glory for the people of Israel and for their God being restored is talked about in ways that are familiar from the days when the people of Israel were a nation. It's a strange admixture, and it's one that I think we can learn from. When I think about this conundrum theologically, the disciples of Jesus pop readily to mind as illustrative of the core problem. As presented in the Gospels, here specifically in Mark 10, we remember that we have seen the disciples ready to follow Jesus, but we also have noticed that they were constantly misunderstanding him and his teachings, and those misunderstandings were largely rooted in their expectations. In this passage, they are where we are in this season of Lent. They are on the road to Jerusalem. And there is, the text reports, some nervousness about that journey. Jesus is instructing the disciples about what's going to happen to him while they are there. It couldn't be any more clear. But this reporting was not what they were expecting. John and James make that point immediately following when they ask Jesus to do something for them, to give them a position of privilege in the new order that is being established. Listen to what Jesus ultimately tells all of the disciples about what the kingdom will look like. He says, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But this is not the way it is among you. Whoever wishes to become great must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be a slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." You know the story well enough to remember what happens. Following their first days in the city, following the celebration of the Passover, they still remain clueless. Jesus, for instance, asks the overeager James and John to stay awake with him in the Garden of Gethsemane while he prays. They fail in that task. And when Jesus told them not to fight with the guard who came to arrest him, they flee and leave Jesus alone. You see, what Jesus was experiencing was not how they understood Messiah. It did not conform to their expectations of how God was working to set up a kingdom. In this way, they are like Isaiah in chapters 40 to 55. The new idea is out there. They can hear it. They can even articulate it at points, but they are still bound to their old expectations. They are still stuck. They don't know how to move out of that old paradigm into the new thing fully. What is it about us that gives us this impulse to move backwards from our now instead of forward into the future? Abraham Maslow, the psychologist, gives us some clue to our psychology in these moments. He says, perhaps adjustment and stabilization, while good because it cuts your pain, is also bad because development towards a higher ideal ceases. In short, he says, we do this because we are trying to find our footing. We're trying to stabilize, to adjust. And that helps us feel secure. That helps tamp down our pain. But in those moments, we can lose our way to the real possibility for growth. And now I come to the reason why I wanted us to read Isaiah 47, why I like paying attention to it. It's like holding a mirror up to us and asking us to see our worst selves. It's asking us to take a look at the self that takes satisfaction from the pain and suffering of others, the self that puts one's political or personal advancement above the human toll of what is unfolding right before our eyes, and the self that credits those impulses to God. We are still too often like Isaiah, like James and John, a long way from understanding the dynamics of God's love and God's embrace of all people. We are still often willing to cut off others for our own perceived gain. We are still a long way from being able to suffer with ones who have caused us harm. And we are still way too far away from being able to utter, "Forgive them, God, for they know not what they do," from our crosses. It's a lot to think about this week. Thank you, and I look forward to continuing our series on Isaiah 40 to 55 next week.